for coming on, Nyberg, and talking about literacy. You and your family are on a march for literacy because of your grandfather, Captain James Arruda Henry. His story is fascinating because he could not read or write, but learned to do so in his 90s. So take me through how you all, the family, discovered, oh my gosh, he can't read or write. What were the turn of events that has led to this book in a fisherman's language that is going gangbusters right now? It's a sweet story about a grandfather, if you will, who decides to finally read and write. So how did the family first decide, or how did they first find out he could not read or write?
Well, we didn't know he had, we thought he didn't have a high school diploma. And that's all we ever knew, and we never thought further because he'd pick up the paper after dinner and he'd look at it and read it, et cetera, et cetera. He would
pretend to read it.
Totally pretend, and he was so competent. So we never even questioned that. We just figured, okay, guy that age had to go out to work, didn't finish high school, but we never, ever in a million years didn't think he couldn't read or write. So a friend of mine had gone to a library event, and the event had one of the...
Was this in Stonington, where he's from?
Well, in the town adjacent, where he actually ended up residing in his last years, in Groton, Connecticut. And they had the co-author of a book called Life is So Good with George Dawson, which he refers to, which is written by a 98-year-old man who was illiterate and then got his high school diploma, I think at 103 years old.
Which is awesome.
Just amazing. And he was the son of a slave, so he had very few opportunities to get his education, and he was always held back. And my grandfather went through the same types of holdbacks, being an immigrant and being pulled out of school and struggling during the Depression and all of that. So he really related to this guy's story. And the reason the story came to our house was because a friend of ours had an excerpt that she photocopied for me. And she said, I know your grandfather doesn't have his diploma. Maybe he'll go back and get his high school diploma. Read him this paragraph. Or she didn't say read it. She said, let him read it. So I brought it to the house and I said, hey, Pop, you know, I think you'll find this interesting. Read this. And I handed him it, and he took it in his normal sort of intelligent way of accepting and receiving information. And he looked it over, and he just said to me, that's pretty interesting. He goes, you know, but there's a couple words in here I'm not quite sure of. Would you read it back to me to make sure I understood it clearly?
So he learned how to fake his whole life.
Totally faked everything. He really did. And so he said, well, if that man can do it, so can I. I'm going to get my diploma. And 2 weeks went by, and he started with his signature, and we couldn't figure that out. Like, why are you practicing your signature? Because he could write his signature, just barely.
And he was how old when he was
91 and a half.
Okay.
And his wife was still living. Our grandmother was ill, but she was still there with him. And she had a very removed attitude about his learning process, which was interesting as well, because she was the only one that knew his secret. So she, I think, was feeling quite challenged. At one point, it was almost as if he was sneaking away off, you know, having a secret lover somewhere, because he was always trying to do his signature in the ABCs at the kitchen table, and she'd be in the other room, unable to really be too active.
So he learns eventually then, in his mid-90s, how to read and write. And you and I have talked about how painful it must have been for him to fake it all these many decades. I can't read or write.
Right.
I can't imagine, which is leading to all of your family's mission to get this book out there, A Fisherman's Language, which he then wrote. He was able to get this out, and you said type it, and you have some examples of some of his handwriting, which is so sweet. If we just want to hold this up.
This way. Yeah, I mean, you could just see how many different times he tried to write different. He tried every single way until he could break it, because he was, at this point, he was using the dictionary, because he started off with the ABCs, and then something came up which he had to reveal, I'm completely illiterate, and we went, oh, we were completely shocked.
Tell me about that. Tell me about that day.
He had signed something he couldn't read a while back before this occurred, and his nephew was over visiting, and he read the document and said, hey, do you understand the implications of this? This is what this means. And he said, that doesn't mean that. And he said, well, sure it does, Uncle Jim, read it. And he just froze up, and he knew there was no way around it, because it was so devastating for him to find out what he'd signed, and it just tore all the walls down. And he said, I can't read it.
Were there tears?
I wasn't in the room. I didn't get to know, and I don't think he cried. I think he himself was still stunned. And he told me like I think I learned of that a couple days after that visit from his nephew. And he said, I can't read or write. I completely can't. And I'm like, I don't get it. And then it hit me. I'm like, that's why you were doing the ABCs and we only had a children's dictionary with pictures. And he thought that was just dandy. Because then he started to correlate pictures and words. And he kind of crept along with 3-letter words and sight recognition until Graham passed. And then he got depressed. And then he really went into a slump. And he was learning to live alone. I mean, he taught himself to cook. He was baking bread. And he went through a 4-year transition where he did not touch his books. And they just sat. And then the funeral home was sending him pamphlets of grief, you know, grief, how to deal with it, you're not alone.
Sure.
And he was so desperate that he began to try to read that. And it kind of stirred him up a little bit. And then he broke his hip. So he had a year rehab. And then he went back to live alone. And then he had another flare-up of polymyalgic rheumatitis, or rheumatica, which is kind of like rheumatitis, arthritis. And he had to go into assisted living.
So when did he get to the academy to sit down, to start reading, and this book finally comes out?
Right then. He had no choice to go home because he was alone and he couldn't manage. Even though he was perfectly capable, it was a dormant condition, and the doctor said, Medicare won't cover you if you're not in a safe environment, and it's not safe enough if something should occur. So we went and got him into the Academy Point at Mystic, and he got severely depressed. And I was actually out of the country visiting my children at the time, and my sister was solely taking care. And she said, she called me, she's like, Marlisa, he is like border suicidal. He just.
So what happened?
He said, you know what, if I'm going to be in here, I'm not going to just sit and look at the corners and rot away. I'm going to do something. I'm going to finish learning to read and write. That was it. It was the impetus for him. All of his independence being taken away and knowing that that's all he had. And my sister knew how excited he was when he was learning. So she went and got Mark Hogan at the Literacy Volunteer Group in New London. And that was it. They started 3 times a week. He came and sat for 2 hours. And he got my grandfather into a 5th to 6th grade, 7th grade reading level. Mm-hmm. He loved to read. He could read fluently, and he understood grammar when he was reading. But the writing took a long time.
This story went all over the place. TV started to cover it, that this man in his mid-90s started to read and to write and felt such freedom. And he would go into the classroom and be with children a lot. And he would tell his stories. And when we aired some of these stories at News 8, there wasn't a dry eye in the house because we saw what was going on here and what was emerging. He has since passed. He would have been 100 years old.
This Friday.
This Friday. The state has since proclaimed a special day for him in June. You have T-shirts, which I think are cute. If you'll just hold that up and show that.
Well, the kids always called him Mr. Jim Henry. And it said they always chanted with him when he'd come visit, keep reading. And then they would all giggle and laugh, including him. And this is a game piece for the literacy game that we've procured from that interaction, because the book's traveling around the country from state to state, and the kids can take their felt pens, the fabric pens. And as the state travels, they can check in on the website, and then they fill in the states, and then once it's all filled in, off to the president's desk, hopefully, so it travels further around the world.
Which would be awesome.
And the kids love to stay connected with the next bunch of kids. Like, they were sad when the game had to leave, and they're like, what are we going to do? So now we have a pen pal program, and they're actually critiquing the book and talking about the literature that's in the book.
Which are sweet stories about his life. Fast forward now. He has left this planet, but there are a lot of things happening because of the round of this grandfatherly-like figure. And this may end up, his life may end up being a movie. Tell me what's going on with that.
As little as I can.
As little as you can, but there's some exciting things happening. What's going on? Well, who picked up this book to say, you know what, this is such a sweet story, I think this is a movie. And I said that when I first heard this about him.
And we were shouting in our living rooms when you did too. It was so exciting. I think it was divinely driven, because the young man that actually just yesterday, last night at 7:30 p.m. completely revised the screenplay is the son of a sports writer, and he's a writer himself, and he writes in the evenings. He does and all through the night, and he sleeps during the day, so he's kind of backwards on the clock. And he said he was just clicking around on the web at night, late one night, because he wanted to just check out something going on with sports for his father. And on the side of the page was the news flash about this man. So he clicked on it and he ordered a book. Now, the interesting part about that was that at that point in time, we had the books printed in Canada, shipped to the house, and we were trying to distribute them. And of course, we never did anything like this in our lives. It was thrown at us in a tidal wave. And we had problems technically with the PayPal issue. So there were backups, like some people got more books and they sent them back. Or they sent us money and said, this is great, I'm going to send this on. Or they had so much patience with us and they waited for the book to come. But Gabe's book actually got to him in a day or two, like, because he was right in New York City.
So he read it and said what?
Instantly. And he ran to his partner, which is his boss, and he owns a small independent film company in the city. Another young man, brilliant, fun. We just have gotten so close over this course of time because they fell in love with my grandfather. And they said, you know, give us a shot. He actually didn't even say that. He said, we love your story, please, you know, can we propose to write a contract to you? Will you look at it? We'd love to have the rights for the film. And we were getting bombarded from publishers.
And what do you know about any of this?
Absolutely,
it's
exactly.
Just coming out of the woodwork.
So it had to come from the heart. And I really, at that point, it was just the tidal wave like in his book. And I
Where he
had
talked
a
about
feeling.
being a fisherman.
Exactly. And I just said, you know what, these guys are young and they're ambitious and they need a shot at something, and I think this is a good match, because if anyone can get this done before he passes, which unfortunately we were so close,
yeah,
these young kids can do it. This is what they need and we need them, so let's make it happen.
But this is out in Hollywood now, and what's going on with this?
Yep, today the screenplay went on the desk of a Academy Award winner producer, and he already had been meeting with our company and loved the story and loved the screenplay and wanted it sort of reworked a little bit to see if they could make it coordinate with how they work. So we're crossing our fingers.
How soon will you know?
Hopefully by the end of the month.
And you're going to call me, of course.
You betcha.
This is a sweet, wonderful story about a man who couldn't read or write, but told his life story eventually in this little book, in these little chapters. And I think everybody should read it because it's a slice of Americana, and you don't hear his pain in here, you just hear his stories, but it's so inspirational for people who cannot read to say you can do it even in your 90s. Lisa, thanks so much for bringing us the story. And I wish you luck, and I hope it's a Hollywood-made movie.
Oh, thank you. Thanks
so much.
We'll be back.
Okay.
I hope so.